wanted to start with the public markets now, given everything you've seen from Google to SoftBank to now running a public company. Do you think we're in a bubble that's about to pop?
Well, I think, Emily, I remember being an analyst in 1999 and looking at the markets, and the markets were, I think, well ahead of their expectations. I think today it's slightly different. I think if you look at what we went through the pandemic, you look at where interest rates are, money is cheap, so you are seeing valuations run slightly ahead of where they need to be. But I also believe the next decade is going to be the golden era of tech. So you might believe the golden era of tech is behind us. I think the next 10 years is going to be even more tech-enabled than the last 10 years have been. To some degree, some of the valuations may be okay. I think money is cheap, therefore people are sort of putting a lot more expectations into the stocks that are going public right now. Some of this will normalize, but I think a lot of them might just ride it out. I think you had Ed before who showed you that 15,000% return on Tesla in 10 years. Could you call that?
Probably not. Why do you think the next 10 will be the golden era or more golden than the last?
If you looked at the pandemic that we just went through, it proved to us that every company that survived this, or that every company that's doing well right now, every one of their customers, everyone has converted to tech. The people who were the most reluctant adopters of tech are now tech savvy, and they're tech first because they're the most vulnerable parts of our society who are basically having to go do everything remotely, whether it's DoorDash or Uber Eats or Instacart. All of these things which are going to have to go through a technology adoption curve have literally had their entire expectations change within a span of 1 year, what would have taken 5 to 7 years. Look at Zoom. Every one of these phenomena, which are tech-first phenomena, have happened in a very compressed period of time, which basically are changing consumer sentiment, consumer behavior, forcing all the bricks and mortars to get very, very tech-enabled very, very quickly, driving a huge amount of demand, both in the enterprise side as well as on the consumer front.
Now, you've been on the show a few times over the last decade, and when I went back to look at that old interview, that first interview from 10 years ago, I realized I could ask some of the same questions I asked then today, like how does Google diversify revenue beyond advertising? Does Google have too much power? Google's power is being scrutinized right now, and I wonder, do you think Google has too much power, or is it a monopoly?
Well, I think in the last 10 years, obviously, there's been very many tech companies that have become very large, and they've become large purely because their products have been loved by customers, whether it's Facebook, Google, Apple. All these companies have seen tremendous amount of consumer adoption of their products, so they become large because they're global companies, and hence they generate a lot of revenue around the world. I think there are certain parts of all of their businesses that need to be looked at because now they're the new order. 10 years ago, I remember being in a show and we were still deemed as a challenger. Today, this is a new order, and there are certain parts of the new order that need to be scrutinized.
So the power of big tech in general, then, do you believe we need more regulation? Are there any breakups in order, whether it's Google or Apple or Amazon or Facebook?
I think to your first point, in terms of power of big tech, as long as there's competitive products available in the market, I don't think being big is bad. As long as there are people who have a choice, they can go from your product to somebody else's product, as long as you're not being held captive to a certain piece of technology. I don't think that's necessarily bad. You have global companies that can operate around the world remotely, effectively, in 100 plus countries without having to set up physical infrastructure. You are going to get larger companies. You are going to get many more trillion-dollar companies, whose underpinning will be tech. So I don't think tech is bad per se in itself. I think there are certain parts of that business where if they have a stronghold on a certain market, that should be looked at. And regulation has never been great for anyone. So, but some degree of self-regulation, perhaps some degree of scrutiny to make sure that everybody's getting a fair playing field is called for. But I don't expect large-scale breakups or large-scale regulation across big tech.
So Nikesh, Ed has been listening, and he calculated that Palo Alto network shares are up almost 800%. Over the last decade. I want to talk about the cyber landscape because we are unwinding the biggest hack in world history, the SolarWinds hack. And I'm curious, are we ready? Are we ready for the next big cyber threat? And where is that threat going to come from?
Well, if you follow on from the notion that the next 10 years is going to be even more tech-enabled than the last 10 years have been, we're creating more and more exposure across the entire infrastructure. Not everybody is ready to withstand the possibility of somebody hacking against it. We are as a country, or as perhaps as a world, going through one large hack. I think we're going to get bigger hacks in the future. This 2020 had the most amount of cyber attacks than we had ever in the history of cybersecurity. So you are seeing with people working from home, with people, with distributed infrastructure, every company being accessible from every part of the world, you are increasing what we call the surface area of the enterprise, and that surface area needs to be effectively protected. So I think you are going to see a surge or continued surge in cybersecurity spending or cybersecurity needs in the next 10 years, just that we're going to see a surge in requirements for enterprise software.
Now, the pandemic has tested all of us and certainly every CEO, and I'm curious how that's impacted your leadership over the last 10 years and how you plan to create the workplace of the future now that you've learned what you've learned.
Emily, when the pandemic hit, I was advised by a great wise CEO that you should spend a lot more time with your teams. And that's what we did as a company. I spend 50% of my time now talking to employees, doing one-on-ones, doing larger group meetings, probably one a week, of more than 100 people. And part of that has been trying to make people feel secure, comfortable, because people are going through a lot in their lives right now, both personally and professionally. I think that has borne fruit for us. It has proven to us that our employee scores are the highest, or people are relatively happier given what's going on. But I think we are going to have to come back to some sort of a normal, which is different from what we've been used to. We've been building a program called FlexWork with our friends at Zoom, Box, Splunk, as well as many other players in the industry. And in that context, where we've come to is that we think people will come back to work, but perhaps not for 5 days. So we're going to end up with some sort of a hybrid outcome post the pandemic.